you will remember that one of the characteristics of life is the ability to reproduce. And so reproduction is allowing us to produce offspring that can continue on. One of the characteristics of life that is oftentimes not mentioned in your textbooks is that we tend to die, right? And so this just allows for organisms to pass their genes on to another generation. When we talk about reproduction, we have the difference between asexual versus sexual reproduction. And actually, asexual reproduction makes a lot more sense in terms of the ease at which it can be accomplished, right? So A means without, so this would be without sex. And so this means that the offspring are identical to the parent. Specifically genetically identical. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, in this case, the offspring are genetically different than the parents. And when we look at where asexual reproduction is common, it tends to be in places where variation is not that important and the environment is stable. So that if the parent is able to do well in the environment, they could essentially produce a clone of themselves that will also do well in the environment. When we look at sexual reproduction, this tends to be in new environments. So if you're going to produce an offspring that is going to swim off into a new environment and settle down, you want to reproduce sexually because maybe in that new environment, your genetic blueprint is not going to be ideal, but maybe there would be a better combination of genes for the new environment. So when we talk about asexual reproduction, sometimes we talk about fission. That means kind of like breaking apart, and also budding are two examples. So if we look at some examples of these, this would be a sea anemone. It is in the phylum Nidaria. And when you see a colony of sea anemones in a tide pool, oftentimes it is because they have reproduced asexually. So once they get to a particular size, they can actually just come apart, right? So they can separate into two individuals. We also see that in, say, for example, coral, which are like miniature polyps. And then when we look at the hydra, which is a hydrozoan, also in the Cnidarian, we see that there is budding. And so they can produce a whole nother offspring. And this offspring is genetically identical to the parent. When we look at sexual reproduction, sometimes sexual reproduction involves individuals that are both males and females. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, typically we define the male as the individual that produces the smaller gamete. And this generally takes less energy. And so when we talk about males, we're talking about the production of sperm. And oftentimes there is competition, male competition for females, because when we look at the female, they produce the larger gamete. So this is the individual that produces the larger gamete. So this would be the egg. And oftentimes females also maybe retain the eggs inside of them, maybe give live birth, and then maybe also take care of the offspring. So females tend to be a more limiting resource than males. And so they tend to, if you're female, you tend to be able to reproduce But if you're a male, you tend to have to compete for the ability to reproduce. And I'm talking about in general over all of the animal kingdom, because it's not always the case for that. So if we look at these organisms, they are nudibranchs, and you should remember that these are in the phylum Mollusca, and they are gastropods. And so like the earthworms, they are hermaphrodites. So this means that they are both male and female. So they produce both egg and sperm. And this is what is normal. There's been a lot of talk about human hermaphrodites, and that has to do with probably a situation where you have a chimera, where the male and the female fuse in the mother's womb. So you have two offspring that come together, twins, and then you have an individual that is male and female. But generally they don't produce both egg and the sperm. So this is hermaphrodites. This is like their typical style of breeding. And so in this case, they just swap sperm, and that allows them to both produce offspring. Remember that we talked about how the endoparasites, including tapeworms and flukes, for example, are hermaphrodites. And in the case of the tapeworm can actually fertilize its own eggs with its own sperm, or it could use sperm from another tapeworm. So that's advantageous in that particular environment. So even though we have the production of egg and sperm in the tapeworms, and they might be fertilizing their own eggs, that still is an example of sexual reproduction, because the genetic recombining during meiosis could produce egg and sperm even within one individual that would be different. So that is important to realize as well. So it is specifically dealing with the production of egg and sperm.